Hello, hello. You start? No, you start. And I start, okay, yes, and introduce you. Good evening, dear fellows, members and guests, good evening. Welcome to the presentation of Patriotic Covers used within and from the Confederate States of America by John Walker. But before we can start, I have to ask our ONSEC for the numbers in attendance and for the fire notice.
Thank you. As always, it's the fire notice that comes first. So there's no fire test planned today, so if it goes off, there's a door at the back and there's a door here. Just go out down the stairs, go out the front door, turn right and turn right again into the alleyway, and we will count you off. Today we have 108 fellows and members and 5 guests. We have 3 overseas members here. Patrick to my right. We have Trish Kaufman from the United States and Ulia Maras from Croatia. Now, I'm told we've got 2 members here for their first visit, being Brian Perrett and David Hudson. So welcome. Okay. Good. So,
Another first visitor, David Hall.
Oh, I understand we have a third first-time visitor, David Horn. David Horn, welcome. Thank you. Good. Patrick, back to you.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite Trish Kaufman. Trish is the former president of the Confederate Stamps Alliance, and she will introduce our speaker to you. So, Trish, please.
Thank you, Patrick. Before you leave, on behalf of the Confederate Stamp Alliance, I'd like to present this book, which is new publication from the CSA, just written by Dr. Dean Briggs, who is the current president. And my great distinct pleasure to introduce John Walker, who will educate us about Confederate patriotics.
Thank you very much.
Mr. President, fellows, members and guests, good evening to you all. Confederate use of patriotic covers during the Civil War 1861 to 1865. In the booklet that has been prepared, we'll go straight to the format of the presentation, but I'll give you a quick overview. Probably the single most important event or traumatic event that has occurred in the United States since the War of Independence has been the American Civil War. The conflict was brutal and lasted 4 years, and during the course of that war, something like 630,000 Americans died. And the incredible fact is that in all the wars that have occurred involving America since, that number has never been exceeded. So in fact, during the Spanish-American War, the Great War or the First World War, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf Wars and Afghanistan, that figure has yet to be exceeded. The shooting war really started when the Confederates shelled Fort Sumter on April the 9th, 1861. It was a Union fort at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter, and effectively ended when Robert E. Lee, who was commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April, 1865. If we turn now to the secession, what brought about the conflict was as the various southern states seceded, and the reason they seceded was mainly over the question of slavery, but also individual states' rights. The first state to secede was South Carolina, which passed its Ordinance of Secession on the 20th of December 1860. And early in the new year, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana and Texas all joined them. And in fact, they met at Montgomery, Alabama, on February the 4th, 1861, and the new nation of the Confederate States of America was born. Afterwards, Virginia joined Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Missouri and Kentucky were also admitted into the Confederacy, although they never seceded from the Union. Interestingly, the territory of Arizona also seceded and was admitted to the Confederacy, and also Indian Nations, which is today largely the state of Oklahoma, was admitted to the Confederacy. They didn't need to secede because they were actually not part of the United States at that particular time. A new phenomenon really occurred at the start of the Civil War, because both sides, both the Union and Confederacy, produced particularly in the North, large quantities of patriotic covers. Those in the South were very limited. There are thousands of different designs known of Union patriotic covers, but in the South there was only about 200 different designs that were known, and numbers of those are relatively small. Even the most common of the designs only has about 100 covers. Turning to postage rates, to begin with, until May the 31st, 1861, although states had seceded, they were permitted to use the stamps of the United States. The Confederate Post Office took responsibility for its postal services as and from the 1st of June of 1861. It's possible actually to find covers that are actually in two distinct stages with regard to the use of American stamps. A state may have left the Union but had not yet joined the Confederacy. That's known as an independent state usage. After that state had been admitted to the Confederacy, you find covers used where United States stamps have been used in the Confederacy. And that had happened, as I said, right up until May the 31st, when such use was prohibited. The condition of a lot of patriotics is somewhat poorer in the case of the Confederacy, largely due to the ravages of war, climate, and indeed the elapsed time since the events, because it happened, of course, well over 150 years ago now. Turning to postage rates, when the Confederate Post Office assumed control on June the 1st, 1861, the initial postage rate was set at 5 cents for a single letter up to half an ounce for a distance up to 500 miles, and 10 cents over that distance. There was also a 2-cent rate for circulars and drop letters. The overall rate was increased on the 1st of July 1862, so that in fact, irrespective of distance, it was set at 10 cents. I think that's all I need to say about the initial part, and we can now move on into the actual display. This first cover that I'm showing this evening is one of only 2 Confederate patriotic covers that actually was received in a foreign country. It was actually sent to England. It was only discovered in 2006. It's actually a cover front which has actually been rebacked to actually better preserve it for posterity. It was sent from Confederate Georgia on the 20th of March 1861. It arrived in New York on the 27th of March, whereupon it received a British packet 5 mark, and it was put on board the Cunard vessel Arabia, and it arrived in Liverpool on the 8th of April. That vertical mark on the front, looking like a hairpin, is actually the 1 shilling mark for the postage due. The letter was actually sent postage due, which was quite a common arrangement in those days. Of course, a shilling was 5p in our currency today. In fact, the equivalent of 19 cents was due to the British Post Office and 5 cents to the American Post Office, because the distance travelled from Augusta, Georgia to New York. Particularly rare item, as I said, there's only 2 of these been discovered. Another all over patriotic cover Depicts, I should have perhaps said depicts the first national flag of the Confederacy, the 7 stars denoting the 7 founding states. It has a manuscript postmark, Big Shanty, Georgia, January the 17th. Fascinating, an awful lot of the post offices in the Southern Confederacy didn't have hand stamp or cancelling devices of any sort, so it's not uncommon to find them actually manuscript cancelled. Big Shanty actually became quite famous because exactly 12 months to the day after Fort Sumter had been attacked, raiders, Union raiders, were dispatched. They were effectively commandos who actually boarded a train on the Western Atlantic Railroad at Marietta in Georgia, and when the train reached Big Shanty, they actually stole the locomotive, the General. And that was chased through the whole of Georgia by the Texas. And the raiders were eventually captured just outside Ringgold, right in the northern part of the state of Georgia, just short of the state line. 8 of the raiders were actually hung and executed. Just below as well, I don't know whether it was a result of the notoriety of that event, the postmaster devised a very distinctive straight line Big Shanty cancellation. This is just one of 3 that are known on the first issue of the Confederate States General Issues, the 5-cent green stamp. If we move on, this is a letter that was, or a cover that was sent to a member of the Confederate Congress in Richmond. It's actually been used as a sort of semi-official. It's got subsistence department official business. The paid indicates that only 2 cents was paid because it was actually a drop letter, and there was no circular postmark because it wasn't necessary, as it was in the city of Richmond itself. Further examples of the 7 stars flag. The upper one with the first issue, the 10-cent blue as it was issued, and below, the colours were changed when the rates was increased because they introduced a 2-cent stamp, and the blue stamp was changed to a rose colour. Interesting, because the upper one is postmarked Charleston, South Carolina, where it all started with the secession of the state of South Carolina. And the lower one, interestingly, is postmarked Montgomery, where in fact the new nation was born on February the 4th, 1861. And further 7 stars cover, frank with the first issue, 5-cent green, addressed to Lieutenant Edmund Kearney. The interesting thing is its care of Colonel Thomas Jordan. He was an interesting character because he in fact set up really effectively a spy network. He was very closely helped by a very ardent secessionist, Rosa Neal Greenhow. She actually was eventually captured at Brown's Hotel in Washington, and she actually came to this country and wrote quite a best-selling book, but she couldn't settle here and left back for the United States, even though that she wasn't supposed to do that. She was spotted, and in fact she was drowned, but she was given full military honours at her funeral. Another very interesting cover, again 7 stars. This really has 3 points of interest. It is a patriotic cover, first of all, foremost, that's obvious. But it also has the distinctive postmark of the University of Virginia. Many of the colleges and universities in the South had their own particular distinctive covers, and the distinctive postmark of the University of Virginia is classed as also as a college cover. You'll notice in the top right-hand corner as well, it actually has charge TSG. The sender was Thomas Garnett Jr. Very simply, they had no small change in the Confederacy, and postmasters who knew their patrons would allow them effectively credit, so that, in fact, when they perhaps spent $1 worth of postage, the person would go in and pay the postmaster and reimburse him for the postage they'd already expended. Here we have clearly the use of a United States 3-cent stamp, which was still the valid rate prior to May the 31st. It's interesting because it's postmarked April the 10th, 1861, 2 days before, in fact, the Confederates shelled Fort Sumter. Another very interesting 7-star flag with the distinctive Union City negative cancellation and a letter sheet, Camp Brown. You'll notice it's dated July the 9th, 1861. One very interesting paragraph in the letter reads, "About 12,000 troops here, and more coming every day, and some leaving this encampment for Missouri to help that downtrodden state fight for her liberty and freedom. I see the tyrant at Washington," that's a reference to Abraham Lincoln, "does call for 400,000 men to subjugate the South. We have one voice in Tennessee, that is, they will have to walk over the dead body of every true Tennessean before that can be done." This, we believe, is actually a unique cover. It's the 7-star flag swirling around a flagstaff with a liberty cap. It's normally found with 8 stars, but that is believed to be a unique 7-star flag. It's interesting that it's addressed to a Mr. Johnson. Private Johnson was killed in action at Upperville, Virginia on the 21st of June, 1863. We now move on to 8-star flags. 8-star flags were introduced when the state of Virginia joined the Confederacy. This is interesting because, in fact, you'll see that it's got a paid 10 hand stamp. An identical cover to the same addressee in the same handwriting has actually been found, which on the inside cover it actually reads, "Andrew had these envelopes stamped and I'm obliged to use them or lose the postage." Because of that endorsement on the inside, that particular cover has been admitted in our catalogue, the specialised catalogue, as a postmaster's provisional. Clearly, the envelopes were pre-stamped prior to sale, and it's been used as a postmaster's provisional. This can't be classed as such because it doesn't carry such endorsement, but it's almost certain it was actually, it was just such a creature, and that is almost certainly a postmaster's provisional, but it can't be guaranteed as such because there isn't, as I mentioned, the endorsement. Moving on again, some examples of the 8-star flags. The upper one is interesting because it's actually Harper's Ferry. Now, Harper's Ferry is today in West Virginia. I should explain that, in fact, the people in West Virginia were most unhappy that Virginia had actually seceded from the Union of the United States. And in 1863, they petitioned Abraham Lincoln, the president, and as a result, today we have the state of West Virginia. In fact, in 1863, West Virginia was admitted as the 35th state of the Union. Harper's Ferry is also interesting because prior to the war in 1859, John Brown, you've probably all heard of John Brown, who was an ardent, wanted to see the end of slavery, actually attacked the federal arsenal that was at Harper's Ferry. And that, if you like, rebellion was actually put down by Robert E. Lee, who ultimately became commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Below we've got the postmark of Savannah, Georgia, which is integral. And you notice integral with the circular date stamp is a paid marking. Strangely enough, they actually produced stenciled patriotic envelopes. And this is a hand-colored example, probably almost certainly watercolor. Totally unique. Someone actually spent some time actually coloring that in, and it's, as you can see, it's Salem, North Carolina, March the 6th. The scarcest and most difficult flag patriotics to obtain are the 9-star flag patriotics. They were introduced upon the admission of Arkansas to the Confederacy. There was only a matter of days between Virginia being admitted to the Confederacy, then Arkansas, and then, of course, North Carolina. These are particularly rare. The actual stamp is probably a later edition. We think it may well be a replacement. Here's another 9-star flag. Interesting because it has a 3-cent US stamp, but it's actually postmarked the 29th of May, 1861, 2 days before, in fact, United States stamps ceased to be valid within the Confederacy. Here we have an example of a 10-star flag. Interesting because it's forwarded use. In the Confederacy, any mail that was forwarded on from a particular destination they had to pay the postage twice. Eventually, you'll see it's got paid 10, I believe. Quite simply, we believe actually the top figure, due 5, was actually an overpayment of what should have been a 2-cent drop rate, because it's actually addressed in Mobile and it's postmarked Mobile. 10-star flag from Arkansas. Arkansas use of patriotics are extremely rare. Very few are known. This is actually the listing copy in the catalogue, and you'll see it's directed via Little Rock. Here we have a 10-star flag. Obviously, they had to be very quick with the printing of many of these patriotics, as states were seceding rapidly one after the other. And the easiest way of doing it was to include on the blue field an extra couple of stars in the top left and bottom left of the blue field, as indicated there. Another stencil cover. Again, this is a listing copy in the catalogue. A stencil copy that's been hand-collared, and it's, as I said, it's the record copy in the 2012 CSA catalogue. We now move on to 11-star flags. This is in some ways such a sad cover because it's from a soldier, Richard Pittman, to his wife, and sadly he was shot on the field of battle at Chickamauga, and he's buried in the National Cemetery close to the site of that battle. And as you will see, his war letters are actually housed in the University of Southern Mississippi, including the one from this letter. This is a really nice 11-star patriotic cover with a very good copy of the 5-cent green stamp with the bottom sheet margin. It's actually got the Corinth, Mississippi circular date stamp. They basically, in Corinth, had 2 types of hand stamp. A large balloon cancel, and you'll see an example of that a little later on in the display, and this much scarcer double rim cancellation. I love the name of this town, Tangipahoa, which is in Louisiana. The person to whom it was addressed had a brother, Silas Griffiths, who had enlisted in the 16th Louisiana Infantry. It's almost certain he wrote to his sister from Camp Moore, which was the largest military camp in the state of Louisiana at that particular time. This is a cover I particularly like because it shows the 7 original founding stars in a group, and then the 4 smaller stars that you'll see to the right in a crescent formation. It is known as a crescent patriotic cover, and a hand stamp paid 5. A very unusual arrangement of stars in the form of a cross in many respects from St. Joseph. It's to Louisiana, to Thomasin Andrin, who was a plantation owner. And he and his wife moved to New Orleans, where they both lived for the remainder of their lives. There's some period docketing on the cover in French, so they obviously had a French connection. New Orleans was by far and away the largest city in the Confederacy. It fell very early in the war. It fell to the Union armies on the 28th of April 1862. It was by far and away the largest city in the whole of the Southern Confederacy. It had a population at the time of 130,000 approximately. They were treated very harshly, but it was a disaster in many respects for the Confederacy because it really gave, because it's at the mouth of the Mississippi River, it gave the Union Army very shortly afterwards control over the entire Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in half, of course. This is a very nice 11-star flag, a very rare one from postmark Murfreesboro in Tennessee, 15th of December, almost certainly 1861. Interesting because the person who's written the envelope has identified the Confederate flag under the flag itself. An interesting cover here, which has a strange line at the bottom I go to illustrate Georgia Bartow. Bartow was one of the very first Confederate commanders to fall in battle. He fell in battle, and it's said that as he lay dying on the battlefield, he uttered the words, "They've killed me, boys, but go on and take the field." That particular wording is actually engraved on his tombstone. It's actually franked with a pair of 5-cent green stamps to pay the 10 cents rate. Another 11-star flag. This one has been sent by Thomas Getson Traylor, who was actually born in 1842 and actually lived to a good age by those standards and died in 1924. He actually served through pretty well the whole of the conflict from the 1st of July 1861 and actually surrendered with Robert E. Lee and the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse on the 9th of April 1865. Moving on, we've got here a use from Kentucky. For a period from September 1861 until the latter part of February 1862, Confederate forces occupied part of the state of Kentucky, south and west of the Green River. And this was one of several post offices they opened in Kentucky. It's very clear, Bowling Green, October the 24th, cancel. One thing I should just say is you'll see it's actually in an awful lot of these covers are actually sent postage collect or postage due. The reason for that is they were sent by soldiers, and soldiers were permitted to send mail in the Confederate mail system postage due, provided they put their name, rank and regiment as an endorsement on the cover. None of the patriotics from the South are very common. This is by far and away the most common of all the designs. There are about 100 copies of this particular example known. It's actually got the original letter. An awful lot of the soldiers in the South weren't terribly well educated, and some of them, of course, were illiterate. This man has fairly interesting spelling, but he said one of the things he writes in the letter is, there is in our regiment only 70 men that is well enough for duty. And you'll see how it's spelled. I stood guard last night in the mud, half leg deep, and I have to stand tomorrow night. He clearly wasn't too enamoured with his situation at that particular time. He was twice wounded and furloughed later on in the conflict. This is an interesting cover because it's actually a coloured example of the previous one, which was in black and white. In our latest catalogue, which was published in December 2012, there is a footnote that it was thought there were examples in colour, but none had been seen for some considerable time. Shortly afterwards, I acquired this one, and I think subsequently there's at least one and possibly two others being discovered. It's actually addressed to a Reuben Robertson. He had two sons, James Robertson and the other brother was William. They both enlisted in the Confederate Army, but William died of disease at Fredericksburg, and so it must have been his brother who wrote this particular cover. And he was confined at Point Lookout prison until he was exchanged. He was actually captured. This is one of only 6 covers known in this particular design, and it's interesting because it's postmarked New Orleans, and as I mentioned just a few moments ago, that was one of the very first cities to fall. It's actually from endorsed, as I mentioned, and sent postage collect from James Goins, and he was part of the Anacoca Rangers. James Goins is listed as having died of wounds received from cannon shot in the trenches. Some of the things that happened in the Great War happened in the American Civil War. Trenches were dug and an awful lot of soldiers were in the trenches. Men burrowed underground just as they did in the Great War, and exploded mines underneath. And one of the things about the American Civil War was that, in fact, it was one of the first of the modern wars. So much new technology was used. Railways, for example, were used for the very first time. Aerial balloons were used for observation. And indeed, the very first submarine kill occurred in the American Civil War. This is an interesting one purely and simply because, in fact, it's a 12-star flag, and quite simply, the printer has missed out one of the stars at the top. Here we have a very colourful 12-star flag, and the postmaster there has actually used the pre-war paid 3 hand stamp and has tried to convert it, I think rather unsuccessfully, to a paid 5. The actual letter sheet is not actually from that particular envelope, but it is actually part of the same correspondence, so it does relate to the cover. Here we have the 13-star flag. This occurred 13 stars when Kentucky was finally admitted to the Confederacy. I mentioned that, in fact, they were never really part of the Confederacy. They were really a neutral state, and in fact declared their neutrality, particularly after the invasion, which I mentioned a little while ago. Interesting because it's franked by a couple of 5-cent typograph stamps. The Confederacy were very impressed with the stamps that were produced in this country, and they actually initially sent a Major Ficklin to this country to try and persuade De La Rue to produce stamps for them. He actually came to this country after many adventures. He was actually captured and escaped. He went into Canada, he got to this country, and he actually persuaded the company of De La Rue to produce these stamps. They were sent out to the Confederacy, but a considerable number were seized by the federal naval forces, and in consequence, plates were sent out to the Confederacy, and these are actually been printed on native paper in the Confederacy from plates actually produced by De La Rue. 3 years ago, at Euroflex 2015, our specialist society, the Confederate Stamp Alliance, came over and we held a convention, and one of the things that we did was go along to the British Library, where in fact we were still able to see the original die that was actually used for the printing of these stamps. This is the Confederate battle flag. This is the thing that has stirred an awful lot of controversy in the United States at the present time. Sadly, it's been hijacked in many ways by white extremists, so supremacists, motorcycle gangs and the like. It used to be flown from many of the state capitals in the United States, in the southern states, but today it's been largely relegated to museums. Somewhat sad really, because you can't rewrite history. We can only learn from it, and it's kind of sad. There are not many of these known. A fellow collector who's quite a specialist on these Confederate patriotics tells me he believes there are only 4. I think it's actually more than that, but it is a very small number. The initial flag that I showed, the 7 through to 13 stars, was known as the Stars and Bars. You'll recall that the United States flag is called the Stars and Stripes. Well, come 1863, an awful lot of the southern citizens didn't like the fact that the Stars and Bars they felt was too similar to the Stars and Stripes, so they asked for a second national flag. It was actually called the Stainless Banner, but it was more commonly known as the White Jackson flag, simply because, in fact, one of the great commanders in the South was a man called Stonewall Jackson. Tragically, he was killed by friendly fire, and as his coffin lay in state, this was the flag that was draped over his coffin. A lot of the Union forces didn't like this particular flag because, in fact, it had really largely a white background, and very often they mistook it for a flag of surrender. A further example of the second national flag, this time Frank, one of the steel engraved issue stamps of the Confederacy. We now move on to state seals. This is the Confederate state seal of the state of Mississippi. Although it's just got paid 5 in manuscript, it's almost certain that did go through the postal system. And in very small print, actually underneath there is, and you can just about read it, there is the date of January the 9th, 1861, which is the date, in fact, the state of Mississippi seceded from the Union. This is the Palmetto state flag, which is the state flag of South Carolina. It depicts a sailor climbing a mast and nailing the Palmetto flag to the staff. The verse actually contains an error because instead of saying Vandals, it spells Valdals. Cannons were very popular on patriotic covers, and here we have an example. I mentioned earlier on about the 2 distinctive Corinth, Mississippi cancellations. This is the large balloon cancellation, and you'll see alongside the oval paid 5 hand stamp marking. Another example of a cannon. firing. This time it's from Warrington in Florida. This cover was sent by Michael Reed to his father, and tragically, Lieutenant Michael Reed is listed as killed in action at Resaca in Georgia in May of 1864. Here we have an example of, well, a unique example of the Prairie Guards. It's postmarked Ocala, Florida. The previous owner, who's the current president of the Confederate Stamp Alliance, Dr. Dean Briggs, previously owned this cover, and I was speaking to him, and he said, John, he said, it's most strange how this cover came to be used. The best guess that I can have is that it's likely the soldier who was at one time on furlough was at home, left the cover with his wife, and at some point she used it. It's quite a genuine cover though. Further example, this time of the Tenton flag from the Baldwin Blues. Note the postmark this time is in red. An interesting one here depicting a single large mounted dragoon. Remarkably, the stamps paying the 10-cent rate have been applied on the back. It's probably an overpaid drop letter because in fact it's postmarked and it's probably been carried to the city and placed in the mails at that point. So in fact it was probably overpaid by 8 cents. It's actually addressed to William White Clark, who was a Georgia representative in the Confederate Congress. Here we have a couple of two small mounted dragoons. I draw your attention to the last line. I won't read it out, I think you can read for yourself, but it just shows the non-PC of the period. Somewhat sad, but you can see very clearly here the use whereby soldiers who wrote their endorsement on the envelope sent the mail postage collect. This time it's from a soldier serving in the 24th Regiment of North Carolina troops. Again, another example with two soldiers with shouldered muskets standing side by side, and again with the endorsement from the soldier. An interesting one here from for land and life, children and wife. It's actually addressed to Dallas in Texas. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the city of Dallas. Dallas and Fort Worth is a great big sprawling metropolis these days. But at the time of the American Civil War, it was really a very, very tiny place, and actually any mail to Dallas is extremely scarce. It's actually postmarked Canton, and that in itself is relatively scarce, but in fact it's believed that particular grid cancel, Canton, Mississippi grid cancel, is the only one that's known on a patriotic cover. The first, and indeed the only president of the Confederate States of America, was a man called Jefferson Davis. At that Montgomery meeting on February the 4th, 1861, Jefferson Davis was appointed as the provisional president of the Confederacy, and as vice president, a man called Alexander Stephens. The top cover is an example again of a forwarded cover. The lower envelope is actually franked with the Memphis Postmaster's Provisional. As I said right at the outset, to begin with, when the Confederate Post Office took control of its services on the 1st of June 1861, they'd ordered postage stamps, but in fact it wasn't until October of that year that they actually appeared, hence the reason for hand stamp paid markings or indeed postmaster's provisionals. This is a particularly nice item because the rarest of all the general issue stamps was the 10-cent frame line stamp, and this is an example of the frame line stamp. It was just very similar to the other 10-cent stamps that were produced in the Confederacy, but for some reason, we believe it was printed on copper plates. There is actually a border line, a frame line all the way around. Very easily faked, but that is a genuine one used on cover. This is an interesting one because it's actually a patriotic slogan: free trade with all the world, Southern Confederacy at the top. One of the things the Southern Confederacy, or the Confederate States, was always determined to do was to try and engineer trade with other nations around the world. It's actually also an example of independent state usage. It's actually Peru in Georgia, and in fact it's dated February the 1st, just shortly before, in fact, Georgia officially joined the Confederate States on February the 4th, when it was. So for a period of weeks, Georgia was an independent republic on the North American continent. Somewhat irony about this particular cover, because it says free trade with all the world. The letter is all about slaves. It's sad, really, that in fact free trade and the letter is in regard to slaves. This is a cover displaying the oval portrait of General P.G.T. Beauregard, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. He was quite a well-known Confederate general at the start of the war, but he tended to fall out of favor, largely because he didn't get on with the other generals, or in particular the Confederate president. And you'll see again, it's got a Jew 10 marking because it's been sent by a soldier, and the endorsement at the top. And below is in an actual, probably a carte de visite of General Beauregard, a photograph of him. Further example, there are believed to be 13 examples of this particular. It's an allegorical river scene of somewhere in the Confederacy. And this time it has a Wilmington, North Carolina hand stamp with an integral paid 5 within the circular date stamp. This is probably the most widely recognized of all the Confederate patriotic covers. It's the so-called Hanging Lincoln patriotic cover. It depicts President Abraham Lincoln hanging upside down from a tree with a note: Abe Lincoln the destroyer, he once split rails, now he has split the Union. And the other character standing by the side of him depicts General Winfield Scott, who was the first commander of the Union armies. He was actually known by the nickname as Fuss and Feathers. An interesting thing to call someone. He's dropping his sword and exclaiming, "My glory is gone forever. The Union flag is on the ground. The stars and stripes lie in the dust, never to rise." Sadly, for the Confederates, that was proved not to be the case. Here we have a hand-drawn design. And the interesting thing is, the envelope was a postmaster's hand-stamped provisional for Galveston, Texas. Obviously a late usage because it's heavily smudged. There's a clearer impression of it. And someone has actually drawn on the cover a Confederate soldier with a sword, and above that it says "States' Rights." These, of course, are totally unique. They're hand-drawn examples. We move on to now. The South also produced patriotic stickers, which people applied on envelopes. They weren't stamps, and very rarely you find them actually tied to the envelope. The only way you can actually tell that they are definite contemporary use, of course, is if they are hand-stamped, cancelled. And here we have such an example. It's actually written to Mrs. Kell, who was the wife of Commander Kell, who was actually a commander of a Confederate naval raider, the CSS Alabama. The person who's written it, though, wasn't actually her husband, it was someone else. A further example, just tied to the patriotic sticker, and this depicts a sailor climbing and nailing the Confederate flag to a staff. And it's endorsed Private William Pettigrew, Captain Watkins Company, Colonel Garrett's 20th Regiment of Alabama Volunteers. This is a unique example of the Confederate battle flag sticker. The cover has been certified as totally genuine, but because the actual sticker isn't tied, there can't be any guarantee, but I like to believe that actually is a genuine Confederate battle flag sticker. This is one of my favourite items in the entire collection. It's just a Confederate patriotic letter sheet, but it has the original envelope in which it was enclosed. And you'll see that very crude postmaster's provisional of limestone springs. There are only 7 examples of it known, 2 of that circular die-cut, simple 5 in a blue or green possibly, sticker effectively, sent to Corporal Edward Deans. It was actually sent from Limestone Springs by his sister, and she writes this: I congratulate you, my dear brother, in the brilliant victory achieved by our Southern boys, of which you are one. It will be handed down in posterity as one of the most glorious and decisive the world ever knew. Somewhat premature remark, but interesting because it also contains, or with the cover, is a photograph of Corporal Edward Deans, and his black attendant went with him to war, affectionately known as Uncle Henry. Here's an example of a Confederate patriotic letter sheet, the second national flag. Very interesting one because it's actually written by a lady who was quite a Southern belle, and she's writing to the commandant of Anderson prisoner of war camp. In the South, there was a very notorious prisoner of war camp called Andersonville, and right at the end of the war, it was actually, the commandant was Henry Wirtz. And at the end of the war, he was tried because there was tremendous death rate in that particular camp. In the sort of final few months of the war, over 10,000 prisoners died. It wasn't the worst camp. There was one even worse in the north, Fort Delaware, where even more men died. But he was tried and he was actually executed for crimes against humanity. This particular one, though, was written by this Southern belle to the commander at that time, John Henry Winder. And the letter reads, Respected Sir, you would greatly oblige me if you would let me know if I could go home by flag of truce. I'm very anxious to go home as I received a letter from Mother saying her health is quite delicate. And as it has been nearly 5 years since I've seen her, I think it is my duty to go. I can assure you that your kindness will never be forgotten. If I go, will it be necessary for me to have a pass from you? I shall start immediately, will not want to be delayed in Richmond. P.S. I enclose a stamp. And there you see at the bottom is the Confederate stamp for the man's reply. Moving on. One of the things in the South was that paper and printing materials of all sorts became very scarce. And in fact, you find envelopes fashioned out of wallpaper, out of pages torn out of books, and all sorts of adversity usages. And in fact, when soldiers went into battle, they very often either raided general stores if it was in Union territory and took Union patriotic covers, or indeed robbed the dead and wounded on the battlefield. And here's an example which actually depicts what it says or describes as General Sherman's headquarters. It's not William Tecumseh Sherman, who was the one who went through the state of Georgia and burnt the city of Atlanta. It's actually Thomas West Sherman, was often referred to as the other Sherman. It's actually been forwarded, but strangely enough, it should have had a further 5-cent stamp on, but for some strange reason, it did get through, but only with a 5-cent stamp. Here we have another captured Union cover. I really believe this probably was taken from either a dead Union or certainly wounded soldier. Alongside it, it has taken from the Yanks at Shiloh. At its time, Shiloh, and I've actually listed the battle casualties for your interest, was the worst and most brutal battle in America. Sadly, it wasn't to be the case. It ended up as being the 8th bloodiest battle. Gettysburg, of course, was the most and worst battle of the war. Here we have an interesting one because it's addressed to a Lieutenant G.W.F. Harper. This was the son of the postmaster of Lenoir, North Carolina, who produced a very distinctive postmaster's provisional and what appears to be almost like graph paper. And it was actually G.W.F. Harper who climbed a tree and actually carved that particular provisional. But the person standing on the left is George Washington. And Lieutenant G.W.F. Harper actually stands for George Washington Finley Harper. Somewhat ironic that the person was rebelling against the first president of the United States. Two further examples. In the top one, round the head, it's actually George Washington. Someone, the writer, has written Yankee trick. The reason being, the North claimed George Washington, but in fact the South did also because he was actually from Virginia. And the lower example depicts General McClellan, who was one of the earlier leaders of the Union armies. But it says on the side, taken from the Yankees at Winchester. I like this particular cover because it says, the eloquent persuader. I think if I stood in front of a gun like that, I'd be fairly quickly persuaded. It's very unusual, incidentally, to find patriotic covers franked with a 10-cent Rhodes stamp. Here we have an example of the use of a captured Union cover from West Virginia. It's actually postmarked Romney, which today is in West Virginia. Any item of mail on captured Union letter sheets is extraordinarily rare. You can see the rather tatty appearance, but this is actually written by a Confederate soldier from a Union letter sheet that was obviously taken, possibly from either a dead or wounded Union soldier. And finally, of these covers, we have a Union patriotic cover and matching letter sheet. And this has been written by a Confederate soldier who was actually incarcerated in Camp Morton, a northern POW camp. He was actually a Kentuckian, but many soldiers came from Kentucky. Some fought for the Union, some fought for the Confederacy, and this is actually from a Confederate Kentucky soldier. One of the things that I've done is I've actually listed some information on our specialist society, the Confederate Stamp Alliance. And I would like, just as we could draw this presentation to a close, to thank the Confederate Stamp Alliance, who actually kindly paid for the printing of the booklets that you have today. Also for Trish Kaufman. Trish, who's with us today, is probably one of the world authorities on Confederate philately. She's done so much to promote Confederate philately. She was editor-in-chief of our latest catalogue. Also, a dear friend, Stephen Harrison, who has greatly helped me with me scanning the various covers and formatting this presentation. And finally, and this is by way of a tribute, one of my dear friends was a man called Ian Tickell, and sadly at the end of September, Ian died. But he was also one of the relatively small number of people who were members of the Confederate Stamp Alliance in this country. Prior to his stroke, he was a brilliant artist, and he very kindly gave me this picture that he'd painted himself. It actually shows John Mosby, and John Mosby and his raiders actually operated behind Union lines and caused a great deal of havoc and disrupted much of Union activity. And that is now a treasured possession in my stamp den at home. Ladies and gentlemen, that's my presentation this evening. I hope very much you found something of interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. May I now ask John Davis for the vote of thanks.
Mr. President, fellows members, ladies and gentlemen, before I turn to the vote of thanks for John, I want to thank someone else who's given a huge amount of time and effort to the Society over the last 12 months. As one example, he flew in from Thailand on Monday to host the volunteers lunch and slipped away quietly before we had the opportunity of saying thank you. He's plied us with champagne and chocolates and fine food all year. But most importantly, he's led the Society at a very busy time with huge professionalism and attention to detail. So on behalf of us all, I just want to say thank you to Patrick Marcellis. Turning to John's presentation, I've been pleased to have seen extracts of this in the Midlands competition over a number of years, and John is to be congratulated, I think, for sharing his enthusiasm and love of this material at that level and with us today. I think it's a remarkable collection in many ways. He refers to it as obviously a traumatic period in American history. It's very attractive material to look at. I see there's quite a few lovers of illustrated envelopes here, so we all love those. But of course, these are extremely rare and in many examples unique, as we've heard. But what's interesting about this material is obviously the stories behind them, about the people, the places, the events that happened, and I think what's been impressive of John's description of this material is not only his understanding of the postal history, but all of the stories behind them, which really is what brings it to life for me and I'm sure all of us today. So thank you very much, John, for sharing all of that with us. It's been a joy to see them today. And finally, I would, as Trish is here, just like to thank the Confederate Stamp Alliance as well for producing this excellent record of this display and your presentation, which I'm sure will find a secure home in many philatelic literature collections. So thank you to Trish and to the CSA for what they've done as well. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, John. Are there any more questions? Please come here, John, because you will have to answer them.
I have a question relating to... Okay, I have a question relating to the captured covers. Why is it, do you think, that the illustration which is supporting the Union wasn't obliterated by the Confederate soldiers when they sent their mail?
Sometimes they were. Sometimes they did, in fact. For example, if it was a flag flying, they would often obliterate that. You saw on some of the examples, they actually had obliterated some of the references to the Union, but they hadn't completely destroyed all the imagery on there. Why they did that, I honestly don't know. probably they couldn't be bothered, but they have they certainly have made alterations to several of the parts of the design.
Thank you.
There are no more questions. Then I will now give you the plaquette. That's this souvenir from today.
Thank you very much indeed, Pat.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Patrick.
Very kind. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And but don't walk away, because as John Davis mentioned, I'm now obliged to give you chocolates.
Well, I've more.
And it's a Christmas box this time. There, please.
Thank you very much indeed.
John, after your kind words, you're also entitled to one. Please. And of course, Trish, you came all the way from America just to introduce our speaker. That deserves also a small box. I hope so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, and now we will stop with the serious part of the presentation, and from now on we will celebrate Christmas. Last year I was told that the Christmas carols were fine, but that I should also pay attention to those members who are less religious. So I was looking to celebrate Christmas, to be not too religious, and I was also told that being dressed like Santa Claus was not really presidential. So I looked for a solution, celebrating Christmas, not too rather presidential, and not too and Christmas. So I think this will do. Is there any news from tomorrow's Royal?
There is a very small piece of news, which is actually
You have to
huge
speak
and
here.
very important. It's not so much tomorrow's Royal as tomorrow's building, and I'm delighted to be able to tell you that during our sojourn in Bangkok, we were able, by the amazing electronic means throughout the world, to sign the letter of intent for our contract. So we have in fact appointed a company, and it is within the budget that the council approved, and they will be starting work within days. So that's the good news, and I don't have to remind you it has to be paid for.
Thank you, Peter. Next meeting is 1 p.m. It's the group display by the Association of Essex Philatelic Societies. And the reason is that they are celebrating, I think, their 75th anniversary. The current standing display is Overseas Mail to and from Scotland by Catherine Johnson. The next one in January is Prepaid Reply Cards by Eric Scherer. Material will be in the frames until 6 or something. And now, sorry, it's all right. 6:30, sorry. It was written 5:30 on my paper. But before you leave, I would like to wish you a happy Christmas and a prosperous New Year. And I think Christmas is a time for presents, and I have some leftovers from previous meetings. So, so what you will have is Pitcairn honey. There is also some boxes from the end of World War I, from 11 November, from Ypres. There is also some leftovers from the chocolates I just gave you. I didn't finish them all. There is some chocolates left from the volunteers from Tuesday. And last but not least, many members all ask me to bring my own products, but I don't want to do that because the chocolates I buy from the competitors are much better than mine. And cereals, it's not really cereals are not really a present, I think, for Christmas. You have that for breakfast, that's a cheap thing. But cereals, I also sell cereals for business to business, and one of my customers is a friend of mine who has a distillery. So these are my cereals turned into gin. So and that is also available at the exit. And for the rest, I invite you to have a glass of champagne on the New Year and on Christmas. Thank you.